Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we'll be going through 40 mistakes in evolution. And we're not here to endorse these arguments or anything,
Right.
but to understand them.
Yeah,
So it's like peeking into an alternate scientific universe, you know?
absolutely.
So are you ready to challenge some assumptions?
Oh, yeah. I mean, critical thinking means like wrestling with ideas, right?
Exactly.
Even those that make us uncomfortable.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The book wastes no time in tackling a big one.
Yeah.
Speciation. Basically arguing that Darwin's idea of gradual species transformation is shaky.
Yeah, the author claims that the fossil record just lacks the smooth transitions that we would expect, right? If evolution happened the way Darwin explained it.
Yeah, they use the Cambrian explosion as a key example.
Right.
Which was about 540 million years ago when this burst of complex animal life just suddenly appears in the fossil record.
Yeah, it's like evolution went from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Without any clear precursors.
So picture this. A world with only simple organisms. And then bam.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you've got trilobites with complex eyes and all sorts of intricate body plans.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, the book argues this sudden leap challenges the slow, gradual evolution that Darwin proposed.
Yeah. The author is basically saying that if Darwin was right, we should see this gradual buildup of complexity in the fossil record, right?
Yeah.
And instead, what we get is this sudden explosion of diverse life forms seemingly out of nowhere.
Yeah, it's like finding a fully formed spaceship when we haven't even invented the wheel yet.
Exactly.
But the book doesn't stop there.
No.
It digs into our DNA, specifically these things called endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs.
You can think of those as ancient viral fragments that are embedded in our genetic code.
Right.
We inherit them from our ancestors.
Like a family heirloom.
Yeah, like a strange family heirloom.
So the book points out that creatures we wouldn't consider closely related, like, say, foxes and sheep, share nearly identical ERVs in their DNA. And this, they say, throws a wrench into traditional evolutionary timelines.
So the author is saying, basically, if foxes and sheep evolved along completely separate lineages for millions of years,
Right.
how did they end up with similar viral fossils in their DNA? It's like finding the same fingerprint at 2 completely different crime scenes.
Oh, okay. So we've got questionable fossils and puzzling DNA. But the book then gets even more granular, zooming in on the cell itself.
They introduced this concept of the minimal gene set,
Okay.
which is the bare minimum number of genes required for a cell to function.
Like an essential parts list.
Yeah, think of it like the essential parts list for a basic life form.
Right. You can't build a house without a foundation. So what's the problem with this minimal gene set?
Well, the book argues that these essential genes are incredibly interdependent. They rely on each other in such a complex way that it's hard to imagine how they could have evolved piecemeal.
Like trying to build a car engine one part at a time and expecting it to run.
Exactly. Like you're trying to build a car engine one part at a time and expecting it to run before you've assembled the whole thing.
So the question is, how do you go from a non-functional jumble of parts to a perfectly running engine?
Right.
Especially if each part depends on the others to work.
Yeah. The author suggests that the complexity and the interdependence of that minimal gene set points to something more than just random chance.
Okay, so that's fossils, DNA, and the inner workings of a cell. But the book doesn't shy away from molecular biology either.
Yeah.
You'd think DNA analysis would be a slam dunk for evolution, right?
You would think so, but the book actually kind of flips the script on that.
Okay.
And they argue that that intricate dance of DNA replication and protein synthesis and the sheer volume of information coded in our genes actually points towards design rather than random mutations.
It's like looking at a complex computer program and saying, well, this must have just typed itself out randomly.
Right.
It strains credibility a bit, doesn't it?
The author certainly thinks so. They even bring in mathematical calculations by scientists like Fred Hoyle to highlight just how astronomically improbable it is for life to arise and evolve through purely random processes.
So if not random chance, then what? Are they proposing a divine creator snapping their fingers and poofing life into existence?
Not exactly. They do touch upon the panspermia hypothesis, which is the idea that life might have originated elsewhere in the universe and then somehow landed on Earth.
So just relocate the problem.
That's one way to look at it. But the author's main point is that the complexity of life, even in its simplest forms, challenges that traditional evolutionary narrative.
Right.
They suggest that we need to be open to alternative explanation.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty dense territory. fossils, DNA, the inner workings of the cell, and even a cosmic game of past the life form. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it is. And
I feel like we've been on a roller coaster ride.
we're just getting started.
Oh, no.
This book is packed with thought-provoking arguments,
Yeah.
each one challenging a different aspect of evolutionary theory.
Before we dive into the next layer, let's take a moment to let all this information sink in.
Yeah, we need to catch our breath.
Yeah, okay.
We've only just begun to unravel the mistakes in evolution, at least according to this book. Stay tuned for more mind-bending arguments and intriguing alternatives.
All right. Okay, so where do we go from here? I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea that evolution might have some serious gaps.
It's definitely a challenge to our conventional thinking, for sure. And the book continues its critique by focusing on a concept called irreducible complexity.
Irreducible complexity. This is where the book really starts to throw down the gauntlet, right?
Yeah.
Arguing that certain biological systems are just so intricate
Right.
that they couldn't have possibly evolved step by step.
Yeah. And they use the human eye as like a prime example.
Oh, yeah.
It's this marvel of engineering, you know, with the lens and the retina and the iris and all of these interconnected parts working in perfect harmony to allow us to see.
It's incredible.
And the book just asks, like, what good is half an eye, you know? How
Right.
could such a complex system evolve gradually if each part depends on the others to function?
Yeah. It's like saying if you were going to build a camera piecemeal,
Exact.
you wouldn't have a functional camera until all the parts were there
Right.
and working together.
We need all the pieces.
Yeah. So the book argues that same logic applies to the eye and other complex biological systems.
Yeah, the author suggests that the intricate design of the eye and its clear purpose, which is to see, points towards intelligent design rather than just blind chance.
So they're not necessarily advocating for a specific deity or anything like that,
Right.
but just the idea that some kind of guiding intelligence played a role in shaping life.
That's exactly it.
Okay, and they go beyond biological examples too,
Yeah.
right? Pointing to the fine-tuning of the universe itself as evidence for this idea.
Yeah, they talk about fine-tuning.
What do they mean by that?
Well, they argue that the laws of physics and the fundamental constants of the universe
Okay.
are so precisely calibrated for life to exist that it's statistically improbable for it to be a mere coincidence.
Oh, wow.
Like, they cite examples like the strength of gravity and the speed of light and the mass of subatomic particles.
Right.
They're saying even a tiny tweak to any of these values would result in a universe where stars and planets couldn't form, let alone life as we know it.
It's like someone carefully adjusted a set of dials to make sure the universe was just right for life.
Exactly.
It's a mind-boggling concept.
That really is.
So the author argues that this fine-tuning is evidence for something beyond just random chance,
Yeah.
like some kind of intelligence or design principle at work in the universe. And they even bring up the information content of DNA as another argument for design.
Yeah.
So they're saying DNA is more than just a molecule. It's like a blueprint,
Right.
a code
Yeah.
that requires an intelligent mind to create it.
Exactly. They're arguing that the sheer amount of information that's encoded in DNA, the instructions for building and maintaining a living organism, points to a level of complexity and organization that goes beyond what we would expect from purely physical processes.
Yeah, it's like comparing the random splatter of paint to a masterpiece.
Right.
You wouldn't say the splatter created itself.
Exactly.
There's clearly some intelligence behind the masterpiece. Okay, so the book is making a case for intelligent design. But they don't just stop there, do they?
No, they don't.
They also take aim at some of the supposed evidence for evolution, right?
Yeah, they dedicate several chapters to critiquing what they see as flawed interpretations of scientific data that are often used to support evolution.
Like what?
Well, for example, they challenge the idea of homologous structures as evidence of our common ancestry.
Homologous structures. Those are similar body parts in different animals.
Right, like the wings of a bat and the arms of a human.
Right.
And evolutionary biologists will point to these similarities as evidence that these creatures share a common ancestor.
Right.
But the book argues that sometimes very different genes are responsible for these seemingly homologous structures.
So different architects can design buildings with similar features, but they're not copying each other. Right.
Exactly.
They're just using similar principles of design.
Yeah, it suggests that similar structures might be the result of a common design principle rather than shared ancestry.
But what about molecular clocks?
Yeah.
I always thought those were pretty reliable for estimating evolutionary timescales.
The book challenges that. They challenge the accuracy of molecular clocks. These are techniques that use the rate of DNA mutations
Right.
to estimate how long ago species diverged. And the book argues that mutation rates can vary significantly, so relying on a constant rate can lead to misleading conclusions about evolutionary history.
So like a clock that runs fast or slow isn't going to give you an accurate time.
Exactly, and they suggest that molecular clocks just might not be as accurate as some scientists claim.
So they're questioning some of the fundamental tools that are used to support evolutionary theory.
Uh-huh.
But what about natural selection? I thought that was like the core of Darwin's theory.
Well, it is, but the book takes aim at that too. They argue that natural selection is primarily a conserving force.
Oh,
Like it eliminates harmful mutations.
So it's good at weeding out the weak, but not so good at building something new and complex.
Yeah, that's their argument.
Interesting.
They cite examples where, like, seemingly beneficial mutations actually come at a cost, reducing overall fitness.
So if not natural selection, then what? Do they propose a different mechanism?
They don't offer a full-fledged alternative theory.
Okay.
Their main goal is to highlight what they see as the weaknesses in the current evolutionary paradigm and open the door for other explanations, including intelligent design.
So it's like shaking up a snow globe and waiting to see where all the flakes settle.
That's a great analogy.
But it feels like they're raising more questions than answers. So where do we go from here?
Well, that's the beauty of intellectual exploration, isn't it? It's not about having all the answers.
Right.
It's about asking the right questions. And the book ends by urging us to continue exploring.
Yeah.
To be open to new evidence and consider all the possibilities, even if they seem radical.
It's less about evolution is wrong and more about, hey, there's more to the story than we realize.
Exactly. It's a call to stay curious and keep our minds open and embrace those mysteries that still remain out there.
So where does this leave us, the listeners?
Yeah.
What's the big takeaway, the cliffhanger
Right?
that we're left pondering?
Well, if we acknowledge that there might be some mistakes in our current understanding of evolution, where does that leave us in our search for the truth about our origins?
It's a profound question. It takes us beyond the realm of just science and in philosophy, even
Right.
spirituality.
Right.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
And I think we need to take a moment to kind of digest it all.
Yeah. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned, and then we'll wrap things up with some final thoughts. Stay with us.
All right, so we're back. And that deep dive into 40 mistakes in evolution was a real whirlwind. I'm still processing everything.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to unpack, but I think the key takeaway here is that even if we acknowledge that there are some like missing pieces or inconsistencies in the current evolutionary model, it doesn't mean we throw the whole thing out, right?
It's not about discarding everything we know. It's about refining our understanding.
Exactly.
Maybe future research will uncover those like transitional fossils or maybe discover new mechanisms of evolution that we haven't even considered yet.
Yeah, think about the history of science, right?
Yeah.
And we used to think that the Earth was flat and that the sun revolved around us.
Crazy.
Yeah, but new discoveries always challenge our assumptions.
Right.
They force us to like revise our models of reality, and that's how science progresses.
It is humbling to realize that even our most cherished scientific theories, they're always subject to change as we learn more.
Absolutely. But it's also exciting. This book, whether we agree with all of its conclusions or not, I think it reminds us that science is not a like static dogma.
Right.
It's a dynamic process, a journey of exploration, not just a destination.
So it's really about asking those questions,
Yeah.
challenging those assumptions,
Keeping an open mind.
and being open to new possibilities.
Yes.
Even if those possibilities seem a little bit radical.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things I appreciate about this book. It pushes us to expand our thinking beyond just that purely materialistic framework that has kind of dominated scientific thought for so long.
Right.
Inviting us to consider, the role of information, intelligence, maybe even consciousness in the grand scheme of things.
So for our listeners out there, we leave you with this. What if the story of life is richer and more complex than we've ever imagined?
What if the universe isn't just this random collection of particles, but this vast interconnected web of information and meaning?
Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep that curiosity alive. Who knows what amazing discoveries are out there waiting for us? And that's a wrap on this deep dive into the fascinating and sometimes controversial world of evolution. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to another deep dive. And get ready, because this one is specifically tailored for you. You've given us some really interesting material about the theory of evolution.
It seems like you're interested in exploring arguments against evolution, and specifically how they connect with Islamic beliefs about creation. We're looking at excerpts from a book called 40 Mistakes in Evolution.
It seems the original book was written in another language, possibly Arabic, and we'll be focusing on these translated excerpts you've shared.
Yeah, and those rely quite a bit on quotes from various scientists.
So let's just be super clear up front. We are not here to debunk or endorse any particular viewpoint or anyone's faith. We are here to explore the science behind the arguments presented in these excerpts. We want to give you, the listener, the knowledge to critically evaluate these arguments and really understand the scientific concepts at play here.
We'll be diving into the scientific principles, analyzing the author's claims, and hopefully, by the end of this, you'll feel equipped to form your own conclusions.
Okay, well, let's jump right in, shall we? The author starts by challenging the very foundation of evolutionary theory, which is the idea of speciation. Now, just to quickly explain for our listeners, what is speciation?
So speciation is basically the process by which new and distinct species arise from existing ones. It's like branches on a tree of life where one lineage splits into two or more distinct species over time.
Right. So, that's how we get this incredible biodiversity that we see around us.
Exactly.
But the author seems to have a bit of a problem with this concept. They claim that scientists have tried to experimentally induce speciation, like in fruit flies, in a lab setting, by manipulating their environment, and haven't succeeded.
Yeah, that's one of the arguments they put forward. But you have to remember that speciation is a really slow process, and it often takes thousands, if not millions of years to actually occur naturally.
So trying to recreate that in a lab setting would be like trying to, fast forward the formation of the Grand Canyon.
Exactly. It's a great analogy.
It's just not going to happen in that short time frame.
And so the author's point about those experiments with the fruit flies doesn't necessarily invalidate the concept of speciation itself. It just really highlights the limitations of trying to replicate a vast natural process within, the confines of a laboratory.
It makes sense that we wouldn't be able to observe something that takes that long to happen in a controlled environment.
Exactly. So moving on to another quote-unquote mistake, the author brings up endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs. And these are basically remnants of ancient viral infections that have become embedded in the DNA of many organisms, including humans.
Okay, ERVs. So you're saying these are like traces of ancient viruses that are now part of our genetic makeup.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it as your DNA having a historical record of all the viral encounters your ancestors had.
Wow. Okay, so how does the author use ERVs to argue against evolution?
Well, they use the presence of similar ERVs in different species, like, say, for example, foxes and sheep, to suggest that, well, if evolution is true and these species evolved separately, why would they share these remnants of ancient viruses?
Yeah, I can see why that might seem a little bit puzzling at first glance.
It does, but here's where the author's interpretation kind of goes a little bit off track. The presence of similar ERVs in species that aren't very closely related actually provides strong evidence for evolution. It points to a common ancestor that they both inherited this particular viral remnant from.
Oh, okay. I'm starting to get it now. So it's like finding, finding similar family heirlooms in the attics of two distant relatives. Doesn't mean their individual family histories are wrong. It suggests a shared connection somewhere further back in their lineage.
Exactly. And that's what these ERVs are kind of showing. They're reinforcing the idea of shared ancestry and the interconnectedness of life, and showing how species that look really different today might actually share a common ancestor deeper in their evolutionary history.
This is starting to get really fascinating. Okay, so what's the next mistake the author discusses? It looks like it has to do with this idea of a minimal gene set. What is that?
So a minimal gene set is essentially the smallest number of genes that are necessary for a cell to function and survive. And the author uses this concept to basically argue that even the simplest life forms are far too complex to have arisen through evolutionary processes.
So it's like they're saying that a cell, even a simple cell, is too complex, like a miniature machine, to have evolved by chance.
Exactly. They're suggesting that the complexity that we see, even at the cellular level, really points toward intelligent design.
Okay, but isn't the origin of life itself still a bit of a mystery, even from a scientific perspective?
Oh, absolutely. And scientists are still actively researching and trying to understand how that transition from non-living matter to self-replicating, evolving life occurred. But just because we don't have all the answers right now, it doesn't mean that the idea of evolution is wrong. It just means we have more to learn and explore.
It makes sense. It's all about continuously researching, refining our understanding, not necessarily having all the answers right now.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm sensing a pattern here. The author seems to be pointing to gaps in our scientific knowledge as evidence against evolution. But wouldn't that be like saying that because we haven't explored every corner of the ocean, there are no new species left to be discovered?
That's a great point. It's about acknowledging what we don't know yet without dismissing the possibility of natural explanations for things.
Right. Okay. I'm ready for the next mistake the author brings up. It looks like it revolves around something called the Cambrian explosion. What exactly was that?
So the Cambrian explosion was a period in Earth's history, roughly about 540 million years ago, when there was a really dramatic burst of diversification in the fossil record. We see a huge variety of new life forms appearing in a relatively short geological time span.
Wow. Okay. So it's like, a huge evolutionary leap forward. I'm sure the author sees this as a problem for the idea of like slow, gradual evolution, right?
Yeah. You're exactly right. They present this really rapid diversification as evidence against, that notion of a very slow step-by-step process.
But isn't there like a scientific explanation for this, apparent explosion of life that couldn't have just magically happened overnight?
Of course not. And while it was a really remarkable event, it doesn't negate the concept of evolution. Scientists have uncovered several factors that likely contributed to this burst of diversification. One of them, for example, is the increase in oxygen levels in the oceans during this period. That would create a lot of new opportunities for organisms that rely on oxygen to thrive and evolve.
So it's kind of like a plant that spends, years developing this really complex root system underground, and then suddenly within a few weeks, it sprouts and blossoms, seemingly out of nowhere.
That's a fantastic analogy.
It might seem really sudden, but there's actually a long process that was happening before we could see those visible results.
Exactly. And in the same way, the Cambrian explosion was likely driven by evolutionary processes, but it was accelerated by certain factors, like those oxygen levels we talked about.
Right. It's fascinating how sometimes those changes, even though they're happening slowly, can seem really abrupt from our perspective.
Absolutely. And again, this scientific explanation doesn't necessarily mean that there couldn't be a creator involved, but it does provide a natural explanation for this phenomenon in Earth's history.
Yeah. Okay, I see. So it's not always about proving one side right and the other wrong, but it's about exploring different perspectives and interpretations.
I think that's a really important point.
Now, I'm curious about something. You mentioned earlier that the author relies a lot on quotes from scientists to back up their arguments.
Right.
How do we know if those quotes are being used accurately and in the right context? Because sometimes, a single phrase can be interpreted in many different ways depending on, where it came from in the context.
That's a really good point. And it is something to be wary of. It's always a good idea to try and find the original source of a quote and make sure it's being used in the way it was intended.
So our listeners should always be cautious about quotes, especially when they're taken out of context.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is key.
Okay, good advice. Now, I also noticed the author frequently refers to Islamic beliefs. How do those beliefs play into their arguments against evolution?
Yeah. So throughout these excerpts, the author really emphasizes that Islamic teachings are very clear on the idea of a creator and the concept of an afterlife where we're held accountable for our actions. And they see this belief as fundamentally incompatible with the concept of evolution.
So for the author, the idea that humans might have evolved from ape-like ancestors clashes with their belief in a divine creation.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that everyone's worldview, which is shaped by their beliefs and experiences, will naturally influence how they interpret scientific concepts like evolution.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not always about the scientific evidence alone. It's also about how these ideas fit into a larger framework of beliefs and values.
Exactly. And while the author views these two things as incompatible, it's worth noting that many people find ways to, reconcile their religious beliefs with the scientific understanding of evolution.
It doesn't have to be an either-or situation.
Mm-hmm.
Some people see evolution as the mechanism by which a creator brought about the diversity of life we see today.
Absolutely. There are many perspectives on how faith and science can coexist, and it's not our place to, judge or endorse any particular viewpoint.
So for our listeners, it's important to remember that there's no one right way to reconcile these ideas. It's a personal journey that each individual needs to navigate for themselves.
Well said.
Now, I'd love to get into some specific examples of how the author misinterprets or misrepresents scientific information to support their arguments. One that caught my eye was a quote they used from Stephen Jay Gould, a prominent evolutionary biologist. The author quotes Gould using the phrase, "evolution's erratic pace," and seems to imply that Gould himself doubted the gradual nature of evolution.
Right, but that's a really good example of a quote taken out of context.
Oh, really?
Yeah. See, Gould was a strong advocate for evolution, but his work actually focused on a concept called punctuated equilibrium. And that explains how evolution can involve periods of rapid change, interspersed with longer periods of stability. So you can see how taking that phrase, evolution's erratic pace, out of context could really misrepresent his actual views.
That's fascinating how a single phrase can be used to twist someone's meaning. It really highlights the need for critical thinking. Now, I also noticed the author frequently refers to a book by Michael Denton called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. What were Denton's main arguments, and do they still hold up today?
Well, Denton basically argued that there are fundamental problems with the theory of evolution, especially with this idea of gradualism. He pointed to what he saw as gaps in the fossil record and the, seemingly abrupt appearance of complex life forms like during the Cambrian explosion. But remember, his book was published back in 1985, and there have been a lot of scientific discoveries since then.
So some of his arguments might be a bit outdated.
Exactly. It's like reading a computer science textbook from the 1980s. A lot has changed since then.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's be wary of outdated information as well. Now, was there any other quote the author used that we should be cautious about?
Yeah, there was one attributed to Colin Patterson, a paleontologist. It was supposedly a quote where he admitted that there isn't a single fossil that provides a, quote, watertight argument for evolution.
Wow, if a paleontologist actually said that, that would be quite a statement.
It would be, but it turns out that quote has been debunked. Patterson was critical of certain interpretations of the fossil record, but he was not a creationist.
Ah, so another case of a quote taken out of context.
It seems so. It just shows how important it is to really scrutinize the information, especially when it's used to challenge such a well-established scientific theory.
All right, so critical thinking, checking sources, making sure things are up to date. Got it. Now let's dive back into the specifics of some of the author's arguments. I noticed that they seem particularly interested in the complexity of even the simplest life forms. They keep bringing up this concept of the minimal gene set, specifically referencing a bacterium called Mycoplasma genitalium. What's so special about this bacterium?
Well, Mycoplasma genitalium is thought to have one of the smallest genomes of any free-living organism. It has roughly 482 protein-coding genes, and the author argues that even this minimal set of genes represents an irreducibly complex system.
Okay, so they're saying that even with this supposedly minimal set of genes, it's still too complex to have evolved gradually.
That's their argument. They
Yeah.
suggest that if you were to remove even one of these genes, the cell wouldn't function. They imply that it couldn't have evolved step by step.
But haven't we talked about how the concept of irreducible complexity has been challenged by evolutionary biologists?
We have. And remember, while Mycoplasma genitalium might represent a minimal gene set for a free-living organism in its specific environment, there's evidence suggesting that even this seemingly simple genome could have evolved from simpler precursors.
Okay, so how could something as complex as a minimal gene set arise through evolution? It seems like a lot of genes to just suddenly appear.
Well, imagine a really, really primitive cell, right? It might have had a smaller set of genes that allowed it to survive in a particular environment. Over time, random mutations could happen, introducing new variations in the genetic code. And some of these mutations might actually be beneficial, giving that cell a survival advantage.
So it's like this constant tweaking and refining of the genetic blueprint.
Exactly. And natural selection would favor the cells with those beneficial mutations, allowing them to survive and reproduce more effectively, passing those changes on to their offspring. And so over vast periods of time, this accumulation of beneficial mutations could lead to the evolution of more complex gene sets.
Wow. So it's not about all of those genes just suddenly appearing at once. It's about gradual changes driven by those mutations in natural selection playing out over millions of years.
Precisely. And while we still don't completely understand how life originated from non-living matter, scientists have made some significant strides in understanding the early stages of life's evolution and how complexity can emerge from those simpler beginnings.
This is making me think about the power of time and how those tiny changes can really add up to incredible transformations over millions of years.
It's truly amazing to think about.
All right, I'm ready to dive into another one of the author's mistakes. What's next?
Well, they revisit the idea of experimentally induced speciation, which we touched on earlier.
Oh, right, the fruit flies.
Yes, exactly. They bring up those attempts to trigger speciation in fruit flies, specifically through temperature variations. And they use the fact that these experiments hadn't produced a new species as evidence against speciation.
So they're basically saying that if scientists can't make it happen in a lab, it probably doesn't happen in nature.
Yeah, that's their logic. But remember what we talked about earlier, the vast timescales involved in natural speciation? Lab experiments are limited. They can't replicate those long periods and the complex interactions that drive speciation in the wild.
So just because we can't observe something happening in a lab over a short period doesn't mean it doesn't happen in the vastness of nature, right?
Exactly.
Okay, what else does the author take issue with?
Well, they go back to the idea of those endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs.
Okay, quick refresher, ERVs are.
Right, those are remnants of those past viral infections that are embedded in an organism's DNA. It's like your DNA having a historical record of all the viral encounters your ancestors went through.
Right. Okay, got it. And the author uses these ERVs to argue against evolution.
Yes, they do. They argue that finding similar ERVs in distantly related species, like, say, foxes and sheep, goes against the idea of evolution.
So they're saying that if foxes and sheep evolved along separate lineages, why would they share these traces of those ancient viruses?
Exactly. At first glance, it might seem like a contradiction.
It does.
But here's where things get interesting. The presence of similar ERVs in those distantly related species actually provides really strong evidence for evolution.
Wait, hold on. How does that work?
Think of it this way. If you found similar stamps or coins in the collections of two friends, and they aren't closely related, wouldn't you assume that they might have inherited those items from a common ancestor or someone in their shared family history?
Oh, I see. So those shared ERVs suggest that both species inherited those remnants from a common ancestor somewhere further back in their family tree.
Precisely. It's like those shared heirlooms. It reinforces the idea that even species that look vastly different today might share common ancestry deeper in their evolutionary past.
This is blowing my mind. So the author's argument actually backfires. The presence of similar ERVs points towards shared ancestry, which is, a key principle of evolution.
Exactly. And it shows how sometimes a deeper understanding of the science can really flip those arguments on their heads.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. I'm ready for the next mistake the author brings up. What is it?
Well, it seems they're returning to that idea of the minimal gene set yet again.
Okay, the minimal gene set again. They're really focused on that. So they're still arguing that even the simplest life forms and their minimal set of genes are just too complex to have evolved.
That's right. They keep bringing back this idea of irreducible complexity, suggesting that some biological systems are just too intricate to have evolved step by step.
But didn't we already discuss how that concept has been challenged by evolutionary biologists?
We did. And remember, while we don't have a complete understanding of how life first arose, that doesn't automatically mean that we should jump to the conclusion of intelligent design. Science is all about continuous exploration, research, and refining our understanding.
Right. It's not about saying, we don't know, therefore God.
Exactly. The author is basically saying that because science hasn't explained every detail of how something works, it means evolution is wrong. But that's not how science works. Science is all about asking questions, investigating, and refining our understanding over time.
It's a process of discovery, not a declaration of absolute truth.
Exactly.
Okay, so what other mistakes does the author point to?
Well, they bring up the Cambrian explosion again.
Oh, the Cambrian explosion. That seems to be their favorite example to challenge evolution.
It does, doesn't it?
Remind me again what that was all about.
So the Cambrian explosion, as we discussed, was that period in Earth's history, roughly 540 million years ago, when we see that sudden burst of diversification in the fossil record. All sorts of new life forms appearing in a relatively short amount of geological time.
Right, and their point is that this seems to contradict the idea of gradual evolution.
Exactly. They present that rapid diversification as evidence against evolution being a slow, step-by-step process.
But we talked about how scientists actually have explanations for this so-called explosion of life, right?
Yes, we did. And while it was a remarkable event, it doesn't disprove the concept of evolution at all. Scientists have found several factors that likely contributed to this burst of diversification, such as rising oxygen levels in the oceans, new ecological opportunities, and changes in developmental genes.
Right, so while it looks like a sudden leap forward, it was still ultimately governed by evolutionary processes, just maybe accelerated by these specific environmental factors.
Exactly. Think of it like a seed that's been developing a complex root system underground for years. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, it suddenly sprouts and flowers within a few weeks.
Oh, I like that. It's like the growth seems really sudden, but it's actually the culmination of a longer process that's been happening behind the scenes.
Exactly.
Okay, so the Cambrian explosion wasn't so much a sudden poof of new life forms as a confluence of factors that sped up the diversification process.
You got it.
Okay, I think we're starting to see a pattern here. A lot of the author's mistakes seem to stem from misinterpretations of the science, or maybe focusing on things that haven't been fully explained yet, instead of recognizing the incredible progress that's been made in understanding evolution.
I think you're spot on. And it's really important for people to be aware of those kinds of pitfalls when they're evaluating arguments that challenge well-established scientific theories.
Right. Critical thinking is essential. Okay, what other mistakes does the author bring up?
Well, next they take on the concept of homology, which is all about the similarities in structure and development that we see in different organisms.
Right, like how the bones in a human hand are similar to the bones in a bass wing, even though they have completely different functions.
Exactly. Homologous structures are often cited as evidence for common ancestry, which is a key element of evolution. But the author suggests that these similarities might not actually be due to shared ancestry, but could instead be the result of a creator using similar designs for different creatures.
So they're saying that maybe God just used a similar blueprint for creating different organisms rather than those organisms evolving from a common ancestor.
That's right. They argue that the concept of homology is flawed because it relies on subjective interpretations of similarities and differences between those organisms.
But what about all the evidence that suggests that those homologous structures really are a result of shared ancestry?
There is tons of evidence. For example, scientists have found that homologous structures often share similar developmental pathways, even in organisms that look vastly different as adults. That suggests that these structures originated from a common ancestor and have been modified over time to serve different purposes.
Oh, I see. So the similarities go beyond just the way they look. It's about the underlying genetic and developmental processes, too.
Exactly. And, the fossil record also provides strong evidence for the evolution of those homologous structures. Paleontologists have found transitional fossils, which show those gradual changes in the homologous structures over time, linking those ancestral and descendant species.
So the author's argument that homology is a flawed concept, well, it doesn't really hold up to scrutiny.
It doesn't. While they are free to have their own interpretation, the overwhelming majority of the scientific community really supports the idea that homologous structures are a powerful demonstration of the reality of evolution.
Okay, what's next on the author's list? It looks like they're taking on the concept of macroevolution.
You're right. Macroevolution refers to those large-scale evolutionary changes that happen over long periods, leading to the emergence of new species and those higher taxonomic groups. Essentially, it's the big picture of evolution.
So it's about how different species and even entire groups of organisms have evolved over millions of years.
Exactly. However, the author argues that macroevolution is just an extrapolation of microevolution, which refers to those small-scale changes within a population, like changes in allele frequencies.
So are they suggesting that we can't really use those small-scale changes to explain the origin of entirely new species or groups of organisms?
Yeah, that seems to be what they're getting at. They imply that macroevolution requires something more, maybe even intelligent intervention or a guiding force, to explain the grand sweep of evolutionary history.
But isn't macroevolution just the result of those microevolutionary changes happening over vast stretches of time? Like all those little changes adding up to bigger changes.
Exactly. The distinction between microevolution and macroevolution is really just a matter of scale and time, not a fundamental difference in the processes themselves.
Okay, so it's not like we need different mechanisms to explain macroevolution. It's about understanding how those same mechanisms, operating over millions of years, can lead to those big, significant transformations.
Precisely. And by trying to separate those two, the author is misrepresenting how scientists actually understand these processes. They're part of a continuous spectrum, with macroevolutionary changes emerging from the accumulation of those microevolutionary events.
This is really making me think about, those small changes we make in our lives. They might seem insignificant in the moment, but over time, they can lead to big, big changes.
It's a great point, and it's that same principle at work in evolution, just playing out over much, much longer timescales.
It's really incredible to think about. Okay,
Yeah.
what else does the author focus on?
Well, next they take on the fossil record.
Ah, the fossil record. It's like a window into the history of life on Earth, isn't it?
It is. But the author argues that the fossil record is incomplete, and that the transitional fossils, the ones that would show those links between different species, are missing.
Okay, but isn't the fossil record constantly being updated with new discoveries? It seems like every year we hear about new fossils being found that shed light on different evolutionary lineages.
You're exactly right. Paleontologists are constantly making new discoveries, and they're filling in those gaps all the time. And while it's true that the fossil record will always be incomplete to some degree, fossilization is a rare event, the record we do have actually provides compelling evidence for evolution.
So it's misleading to say that the fossil record is incomplete. It's more like it's a work in progress, like a giant puzzle where we're constantly finding new pieces.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, what else does the author target in their attempt to discredit evolution?
Well, they take aim at natural selection.
Ah, natural selection, the engine of evolution. What's their problem with that?
Well, they acknowledge that natural selection can act on the variation that already exists within a population, but they argue that it can't explain the origin of those new traits, those new variations.
So are they saying that natural selection can only pick and choose from what's already there? It can't actually create anything new?
Yeah, that seems to be their point. They're saying that something else, maybe an intelligent designer, is needed to explain those brand new features.
But what about mutations? Don't they introduce new genetic variations into a population? And then natural selection can act upon those mutations, favoring the ones that are beneficial.
That's exactly how it works. The author is completely ignoring the crucial role that mutations play in evolution.
Right. Mutations are those random changes in an organism's DNA.
Exactly. And they're the source of all that genetic variation. Then natural selection comes in and acts like a filter, promoting the spread of those beneficial mutations.
Okay, so it's this two-step process. Mutations provide the raw material, those new variations, and then natural selection acts like a filter. It selects the variations that work best in a given environment.
You got it. It's a beautiful, elegant process.
It is. Okay, so the author's argument that natural selection can't explain the origin of new traits is overlooking a really important piece of the puzzle, those mutations.
Absolutely.
Okay, what else is on the author's list of evolution's mistakes?
Well, they take on the evolution of complex organs, specifically the eye.
The eye. Now, that's one I've always been curious about. It just seems so perfect, so complex. I can kind of understand why someone might have trouble believing that it could have evolved.
I understand. It's such an intricate organ, isn't it? The way it captures light, focuses images, and sends those signals to the brain. It's remarkable.
It is. So how does the author attempt to refute the evolution of the eye?
They argue that it's just too complex to have evolved through random mutations and natural selection.
Okay, so they're saying it couldn't have just happened by chance.
Right. But their argument ignores a crucial point. The evolution of complex structures doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual process that takes place over millions and millions of years.
So we're not talking about a fully formed eye just appearing out of nowhere.
Exactly. Scientists have actually traced the evolution of the eye back to those simple light-sensitive cells that are found in some single-celled organisms.
Wow. So even single-celled organisms can sense light.
They can. And over time, those light-sensitive cells gradually became more and more specialized and organized. Eventually, they formed structures that could detect the direction of light, and then even structures that could create images.
So the eye essentially evolved from these simple light-sensitive cells step by step over a vast period of time.
Precisely. And the fossil record actually provides evidence for this gradual evolution, showing different stages of eye development in different organisms.
That's incredible. It challenges that idea that the eye is too complex to have evolved. Instead, it shows the amazing power of natural selection to shape those complex structures through small, tiny changes, building up over time.
Exactly. The evolution of the eye is a classic example of how natural processes can create amazing complexity.
Okay, what's the next mistake the author tackles?
Well, they delve into convergent evolution, which we talked about briefly earlier. It's the idea that similar features can evolve independently in lineages that aren't closely related.
Right, like those wings in bats and birds.
Exactly. The author argues that convergent evolution actually goes against the idea of natural selection producing unique adaptations. They suggest that if natural selection were really the main driver, we wouldn't see those similarities in unrelated organisms.
I could see their point. If it's all about adapting to specific environments, why would unrelated organisms evolve those similar features? Wouldn't that point to some other force at work?
It's a good question, but the answer is that similar environments often present similar challenges. So different lineages can actually hit on similar solutions, even if they are not closely related.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of like how different cultures might independently develop similar tools or technologies if they're facing similar problems.
Exactly. Or think about how different car companies might come up with similar designs for their vehicles, if they're all trying to achieve things like fuel efficiency and safety.
That makes sense. It's all about finding the most effective solutions to a particular problem.
Exactly. And so convergent evolution, instead of contradicting evolution, it really highlights the power of natural selection in shaping organisms in response to their environment.
So the author's mistake here is misinterpreting convergent evolution as evidence against natural selection when it actually supports the idea that organisms adapt to their environments.
Exactly.
Okay, what else do they focus on? I'm really curious to see what other arguments they make.
Well, next they tackle the origin of humans.
Human evolution. That's
Always a hot topic. And I can see how it might be especially sensitive given the author's strong religious beliefs.
It is. So how does the author try to refute the idea of human evolution?
Well, they take issue with the idea that humans and apes share a common ancestor, which is, of course, a view that's supported by a ton of scientific evidence, from fossils to genetics to anatomical comparisons.
So they're essentially saying that humans were created separately from other primates.
That seems to be their position. They point to what they perceive as gaps in the fossil record and argue that the evidence for human evolution is weak.
But haven't scientists found a lot of fossils that show the stages between ape-like ancestors and modern humans?
They have. In fact, the fossil record of human evolution is actually quite rich, with many transitional fossils that show the different stages of our lineage.
So the author's claim that there isn't much evidence for human evolution doesn't really hold up.
Not at all. Paleoanthropologists have made a lot of progress in piecing together the story of human evolution, and the evidence from many different fields strongly supports the idea that humans and apes share a common ancestor.
It's really amazing to think about how far we've come and all the changes that have happened over millions of years.
It is. It's a fascinating story.
Okay, so what's next on the author's list of mistakes?
Well, they revisit the concept of genetic drift, which we talked about earlier. Remember, it's the idea that random events can cause changes in the frequency of genes within a population.
Right, it's like that example we discussed with the birds on the island.
Exactly. Sometimes it's not just natural selection driving evolution, but chance events can play a big role too.
And what's the author's problem with genetic drift?
They argue that it's not really a significant factor in evolution and can't explain things like the appearance of new species or those complex adaptations.
So they're downplaying the role of randomness.
Yeah.
It seems like they're pushing for a more directed or guided process.
That seems to be their position. They seem to want to see more purpose or design in evolution. But you have to remember that genetic drift, especially in small populations or isolated populations, can lead to big changes just by chance.
So are they misinterpreting the role of genetic drift in evolution?
I'd say so. It's a well-established mechanism, and it definitely plays a significant role in shaping the diversity of life.
It's amazing to think about how both those random events and natural selection can influence how life evolves, like a delicate dance between chance and adaptation.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
So what other arguments does the author use to try and discredit evolution?
Well, they focus on the complexity of some biological systems, arguing that certain features, like blood clotting or the bacterial flagellum, are just too complex to have evolved gradually.
So they're bringing up irreducible complexity again, the idea that some things are too intricate to have evolved step by step.
You got it. They suggest that these complex systems had to have been designed, completely formed, implying a designer had to be involved.
But haven't evolutionary biologists challenged that concept?
Yes, they have. And just because we don't fully understand the exact evolutionary pathway that led to a specific feature, it doesn't mean it couldn't have evolved naturally.
Right. It's like saying, well, we don't know exactly how the pyramids were built, so aliens must have done it.
That's a great analogy. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Right. Just because we don't have all the answers right now doesn't mean we should jump to supernatural conclusions.
Exactly. Science is all about continuing to explore and ask questions. What seems impossible to explain today, we might have an answer for tomorrow.
I love that. It's a journey of discovery. So what other mistakes does the author highlight?
They bring up the fossil record again.
Back to the fossils.
Yeah.
What's their issue this time?
They focus on what they see as gaps, those missing links in the evolutionary history of some organisms.
But we were talking about how new fossils are constantly being discovered.
Exactly. Paleontology is constantly evolving, and those new findings help us refine our understanding of how life on Earth has changed over time.
So it's kind of misleading to claim that gaps in the fossil record disprove evolution. It's more like we're always adding new pages to the book of life.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay, what else do they focus on?
Well, they shift gears and talk about natural selection again.
Natural selection. What's their take on that?
They argue that natural selection, while it can explain how organisms adapt to their environment, it doesn't explain where those new traits or variations come from.
So they're saying natural selection can only work with what's already there. It can't create anything new.
Right. They suggest that you need some other mechanism, maybe an intelligent designer, to explain the origin of those new features.
But what about mutations? Aren't those random changes in DNA the source of new variations? And then natural selection acts upon those mutations.
Exactly. The author is ignoring a crucial piece of the puzzle here. Mutations are the source of all that genetic diversity.
So it's like a two-step process, right? Mutations provide the raw materials, those new variations, and then natural selection comes in and acts like a sculptor, shaping those variations over time.
That's a great way to describe it. It's a beautiful and elegant process.
It is. Okay, what else does the author bring up in their arguments against evolution?
Well, they focus on macroevolution again.
Macroevolution, that's the big picture evolution, right? The evolution of new species and major groups of organisms.
Exactly. The author argues that macroevolution is just an extension of microevolution, those small-scale changes within a population.
So they're suggesting that we can't use those small changes to explain those bigger changes, like the origin of entirely new species.
Yes. They're saying we need something more to explain that, maybe something beyond natural processes.
But isn't macroevolution really just the accumulation of all those small microevolutionary changes over very, very long periods of time?
Exactly. The author is trying to create a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution that doesn't really exist in the way scientists understand it. They are part of the same continuous process.
So the author is drawing a line where there isn't one.
Essentially, yes.
Okay, what else do they bring up?
They go back to the concept of homology, which we were discussing earlier.
Oh, right, those similarities we see in different organisms.
Exactly. The author again argues that those similarities don't necessarily mean those organisms share a common ancestor. They suggest, again, that maybe a creator just used a similar design template for different creatures.
So instead of evolving from a common ancestor, those similar structures are because a creator used similar blueprints.
Right. But remember, there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that those homologous structures are actually the result of shared ancestry.
Right. Those similar developmental pathways, those transitional fossils.
Exactly. The scientific evidence really supports the idea that homologous structures are a powerful demonstration of evolution in action.
Okay, what else? This author is really trying to cover all the bases.
They are. And next up, they take on natural selection again.
They really don't like natural selection, do they?
It seems like they're struggling with the idea that a natural process like natural selection could be responsible for the incredible diversity and complexity of life.
So what's their argument this time?
They argue that natural selection is just not powerful enough to explain the origin of new traits and variations.
So we're back to that idea that natural selection can only act on what's already there. It can't create anything truly new.
Right. They think you need some kind of outside force to explain the origin of those new features.
But what about mutations? They introduce those new variations, right?
Yes, they do, and the author conveniently seems to forget about them.
So once again, they're overlooking a key piece of the evolutionary puzzle. Mutations provide those new variations, those new possibilities, and then natural selection determines which ones are going to be passed on to the next generation.
Precisely. It's a powerful combination.
It is. Okay, what else does the author bring up?
Well, next up, they take aim at the fossil record.
Back to those fossils. It seems like every time we talk about the author's mistakes, those fossils come up.
They do. And, the fossil record really is a powerful testament to evolution. But the author argues that it's just too incomplete with too many gaps to really support the theory.
But didn't we already talk about how paleontologists are constantly discovering new fossils, and those discoveries help fill in those gaps and give us a better understanding of evolutionary history?
We did. And while it's true that the fossil record will never be completely whole, it's just the nature of fossilization, the fossils we do have provide a lot of evidence for evolution.
Okay, so the author's argument that the fossil record isn't good enough to support evolution, that's not really accurate.
It's not.
What else does the author take issue with?
Well, they target the evolution of complex organs again, specifically the eye.
The eye. It's incredible, isn't it?
It is. But the author argues that it's just too complex to have evolved through those random mutations and natural selection.
So they're going back to that argument that something so intricate and perfect couldn't have possibly evolved on its own.
Yes. They're basically saying that it must have been designed.
But remember how we talked about how the evolution of complex structures doesn't happen all at once. It's all about those tiny, gradual changes accumulating over millions of years.
Exactly. The eye didn't just pop into existence fully formed.
So how did it evolve?
Scientists have traced the evolution of the eye back to those simple, light-sensitive cells found in some single-celled organisms.
Wow, so even single-celled organisms can sense light.
They can. And over time, those light-sensitive cells became more specialized and organized, eventually forming structures that could detect the direction of light. Then, even later, structures that could actually create images.
So it's like the eye evolved step by step, started with that basic light sensitivity, and then becoming more complex over time.
Exactly. And the fossil record actually shows evidence of this gradual evolution.
So the author's argument that the eye is too complex to have evolved, that's not accurate either.
It's not. The evolution of the eye is a great example of how natural processes can lead to those amazing complex structures.
Okay, what else does the author bring up? It seems like they're trying to cover every possible argument against evolution.
They are. And next up, they take on convergent evolution again.
Convergent evolution, that's the idea that similar features can evolve in different organisms, even if they aren't closely related, right?
Exactly, like the wings of bats and birds.
Right. And the author's issue with that is?
They argue that it goes against the idea of natural selection producing unique adaptations.
So if natural selection is driving evolution, why would we see those similar features popping up in unrelated organisms?
It's a good question. But remember how we talked about how similar environments can lead to similar solutions?
Oh, right. It's like how different cultures might come up with similar tools or technologies if they're facing similar challenges.
Exactly. Or how different car companies might end up with similar designs if they are all trying to achieve the same things.
Okay, I get it. It's all about finding the best solution to a problem.
Exactly. And so convergent evolution, rather than contradicting evolution, actually highlights the power of natural selection to shape organisms in response to their environment.
So the author's mistake here is misinterpreting convergent evolution as evidence against natural selection when it actually shows the opposite.
You got it.
Okay, what else does the author bring up in their critique of evolution?
Well, they tackle the origin of humans again.
Back to human evolution. I can see why this would be a particularly sensitive topic for the author, given their religious beliefs.
You're right. The author doesn't seem to like the idea that humans share a common ancestor with apes. They seem to prefer the idea that humans were created separately.
But we've talked about how there's a lot of scientific evidence, from fossils to genetics, that supports the idea of human evolution.
We have. And the evidence is very strong. But the author seems to be focusing on what they see as gaps or inconsistencies in the evidence, rather than acknowledging the bigger picture.
So it seems like their rejection of human evolution is more about their beliefs than the actual scientific evidence.
That's what it looks like.
It's amazing to think about our evolutionary journey and how we got to where we are today. It's like looking back through time at all those who came before us and all the changes that led to the emergence of humans.
It really is incredible.
Okay, what else does the author focus on?
Well, they revisit the idea of genetic drift.
Genetic drift, right? The idea that random events can influence evolution.
Exactly. But the author downplays the role of those random events, arguing that they're not significant enough to explain those big changes in evolution.
So are they essentially saying that evolution is more directed than random?
That seems to be their position. But we know that random events, like genetic drift, can have a big impact on evolution, especially in small or isolated populations.
Right, like that example with the birds in the storm.
Exactly. Sometimes it's those chance events that lead to big changes in the genetic makeup of a population.
So once again, the author is misinterpreting the science.
It seems so.
Okay, I think we're getting a pretty clear picture of the author's strategy here. They're looking for those gaps in our knowledge or those areas where the science is still being explored, and then using those uncertainties to try and cast doubt on the whole theory of evolution. But as we've discussed, science is all about asking questions and searching for answers. It's a process, not an endpoint.
Well said. I think that's a really important point. And it's something for all of us to keep in mind when we're evaluating scientific claims, especially those that challenge well-established theories.
Right. Critical thinking is key. Okay, so what else does the author focus on in their attempt to discredit evolution?
They delve into the complexity of biological systems again, arguing that some features are just too intricate to have evolved gradually.
So they're bringing up irreducible complexity one more time.
It seems so. They suggest that these systems must have been designed, pointing to the need for an intelligent designer.
But we've already talked about how evolutionary biologists have challenged that idea, right?
We have, and it's important to remember that just because we might not understand the exact evolutionary pathway of a particular feature right now, it doesn't mean that it couldn't have evolved naturally.
Right. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Exactly.
Okay, what's next on their list?
Well, this time they tackle the origin of life itself. They discuss abiogenesis.
Abiogenesis. That's the study of how life arose from non-living matter.
You got it. And the author points out that scientists haven't yet figured out exactly how abiogenesis happened. They haven't been able to create life in a lab.
So they're saying that because we don't have all the answers about how life began, it must be the work of a supernatural creator.
That's their argument. But remember, just because science hasn't explained everything yet doesn't mean it can't or won't in the future.
Right. Science is all about exploration and discovery, and there's still a lot we don't know about the early Earth and the conditions that led to the emergence of life.
Exactly. And while we might not have all the answers about abiogenesis right now, scientists are making progress. They're learning more about the chemical and physical processes that might have been involved in the origin of life.
So the author's mistake here is assuming that because we don't know everything right now, it means science is wrong and we should default to a supernatural explanation.
That's a good summary. Exactly. It's like saying, well, we haven't figured out how to build a time machine yet, so time travel must be impossible.
Right. Just because we haven't achieved something yet doesn't mean it can't be done. There's a lot of potential for future discoveries. Okay, so I think we've explored quite a few of the author's arguments, and we've seen how they often misinterpret or misrepresent the scientific evidence.
We have, and I think it's been really helpful to, take a deeper look at those arguments and see how they hold up against the actual science.
It definitely has. What are some key takeaways that our listeners should remember from this deep dive?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that whenever you encounter an argument, especially one that's challenging a well-established scientific theory like evolution, you have to be critical.
Right. Don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. Dig a little deeper, ask questions, see what the actual evidence says, and look for those different perspectives.
Be curious, be skeptical, and don't be afraid to change your mind if the evidence warrants it.
Exactly. And another important point to remember is that faith and science don't necessarily have to be in conflict.
Right. We talked about how the author sees evolution as incompatible with their Islamic beliefs, but lots of people find ways to reconcile their faith with scientific discoveries.
Exactly. It's not an either-or situation. There are many different ways to view the relationship between science and faith.
It's about finding what makes sense for you, what resonates with your own beliefs and experiences.
I think that's really well said. And finally, it's crucial to remember that science is a process. It's a journey of discovery, and it's always evolving.
I love that. The learning never stops.
It really doesn't. And we're always here to help you navigate that journey of discovery.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for. So to our listener, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the arguments against evolution, the science behind those arguments, and the ways in which faith and science can coexist. Keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions.
And most importantly, keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us.